My husband abandoned me for my mother, but returned when he discovered she did not inherit anything, and I received everything. Hello, I'm in a pickle right now because of my insane mother and similarly foolish soon-to-be ex-husband, who have joined forces to completely destroy my peace of mind for their own selfish reasons. I wish I could talk about this with my friends, but it feels too personal and awkward to discuss in person. Trust me, after I tell you what I'm going through, you'll understand why I say that. I don't have much family, so I can't really talk to anybody else. So I'm going to the Reddit community to get this off my chest, and to ensure that I'm not the evil guy here in any capacity, as I'm being led to believe. So this all started just 5 weeks ago, when my husband of 5 years, let's call him Tom, told me that he wanted to end our relationship because he had affection for my mother. Yes, you read that correctly, and I'm not joking. Believe me, I was as surprised as you are right now, and even more disgusted when he admitted it. When he informed me he'd been having an affair with her for 6 months, I hadn't noticed since I'd been too busy at work, and his behaviour had never been suspicious enough for me to pay attention. Anyway, for reference, my mother is only 25 years older than me. I'm 30, and my mother is 55. My mother had me when she was attending college, but my father was never present. He broke up with my mother the day she told him she was pregnant, and even attempted to persuade her to terminate the pregnancy, but she wanted an excuse to drop out of college back then. So she opted to have me anyway, and told my grandmother, her mother, that she wanted to be a single mother. My grandparents were wealthy enough to allow her to do so, but they were not pleased with her decision to drop out of college. They tried to persuade her to return after I was born, but she refused, and instead dabbled in a variety of professions before settling on interior decoration. She isn't an interior designer. She simply advises people on where to place their furniture and how to decorate their rooms to make them visually appealing. It's a big party for rich people, therefore she's pretty excellent at it. She's not a qualified professional, but my grandfather was a well-known realtor, so he'd get her work. My mother is the flakiest, most untrustworthy person I've ever encountered, and she's really fortunate that she comes from a wealthy family. Otherwise, she'd be on the streets. My grandparents virtually raised me because my mother didn't have enough time for me. She wasn't working, she was socializing. When I was younger, I assumed that my grandparents were my birth parents and that my mother was my older sister. That's how I lived my youth, and by the time I was in my teens, I had given up hope for my mother since she was still as carefree about her life as she had been in the past. My grandfather died when I was in 10th grade, and it was just me and my grandmother against the world from then on. The world, including my mother, because she was usually a pain to deal with. I mean, if you ever have to explain to your mother as a 16-year-old why it's not a good idea for her to travel to Greenland with a guy she met on Tinder 3 days ago, you'll understand what my teen years were like. She's a complete moron who doesn't care about how her actions affect others, including her own family. Gran instilled in me the belief that after she died, I was on my own since my mother would never support me. So I worked extremely hard to reach the top of the company where I currently work, since I did not want to leave anything to chance. I'm the COO of my company, and I make 3 times what Tom does. He is the head of sales at a smaller company, but I have never condemned him for it or made him feel inferior. Part of the reason for this was because I graduated from one of the best business schools in the state and interned at the same company where I currently work, thanks to Gran's connections. She encouraged me to be humble, unlike Tom and my mother, who thought they were big stars over something they weren't even sure of. I met my spouse at a mutual friend's wedding around 6 years ago, and we hit it off right away because we had so many comparable interests. We dated for 3 years before he proposed, and I said yes without hesitation. He was a good man, or so I thought back then. He'd often joke that I had a hot mother, which wasn't entirely false. I would never call her hot because she is nuts, and she is also my mother, but she does meet the beauty requirements for her age. I mean, she's made a lot of money by duping people into believing that her so-called feng shui design works, and a lot of that money has gone towards makeup and Botox, so she's obviously attractive for her age. Also, I don't intend to disparage the actual professionally trained decor specialists, and I suppose the real feng shui works, but everything my mother does is a fraud because she doesn't know anything about it. I admire people who know what they're doing, but since my mother isn't one of those professionals, and she's also a bad person in general, I believe I may speak negatively about her. I had hoped Tom would be different from the other men I'd dated in the past, and that I'd be able to trust him, but that proved to be a bust as well. He'd joke about how my mother was gorgeous enough to pass for my sister, and despite our difficult relationship, I'd laugh it off since no one would believe that something like this could happen to them. I had only ever communicated with my mother because of Gran. She shaped who I am, and I will be eternally thankful for that, even if it meant dealing with her psychotic daughter. She was never willing to give up on Mom since she was a nice mother who loved her daughter regardless of her shortcomings. And then there's my mother, who could never bring herself to love me more than herself, no matter how hard I tried. Even when Gran died almost 2 years ago, I tried to stay in touch with my mother. Our relationship was terrible, but I still looked out for her, more out of loyalty to Gran than for her own benefit. But that changed when Tom told me about the affair 5 weeks ago. He sat me down in the evening after I returned from a business trip and told me, with a straight face, that he loved my mother and that they wanted to be together right now. I assumed he was joking and laughed, but for the first time, he did not laugh. He went on to tell me in great detail how he and my mother had been messing around behind my back for 6 months. Tom and I argued over something silly, and my mother had texted him at the time, seeking assistance on how to fix her computer. That's how they began conversing, and it gradually evolved into something more than a friendship. They had no intention of going too far at first, but it just occurred, and they couldn't stop themselves. I'm sure Tom didn't mind how much my mother resembled me. I kicked him out that night, and he left without argument because he knew he could go to my mother's instead. I suppose I drank a whole bottle of whiskey that night while crying like a baby. I was up until the wee hours of the morning, sobbing so hard that my eyes swelled to double their size. At around 3:30 a.m., unable to deal with the overpowering rage and pain, I decided to text my mother. I was inebriated, which probably drove me even farther to send that text. I called her a lot of names and told her she was a terrible daughter to Gran and a terrible mother to me, and it was only getting worse with age. I warned her that she was a scam artist at best, and that after her Botox and fillers wore off, Tom would recognize her for the hideous witch she was and dump her as well. I didn't expect her to answer, but she did, and the response was eye-opening. She assured me that she could lose her beauty one day, but she would never lose her bank account, which was going to grow tenfold owing to Gran's will. I'd completely forgotten about it while grieving Gran, but her lawyer had promised that we'd be informed of what she'd given us when the probate time ended. It would take about 10 to 12 months, and it had already been 11 months, so we would hear from him soon. Gran had told her lawyer not to tell us what to expect until the probate term was passed. We were only allowed to know where she wished to be buried, so neither my mother nor I knew what she'd left us, but given her wealth, assets and property, we were anticipating a lot. Or rather, my mother was, because all I cared about when Gran died was that she was gone, and now I was completely on my own. The contents of her will didn't matter to me because, in any case, I value relationships before money. But Tom clearly did, which is why he selected my mother over me, because they both expected her legacy to be more than mine. They must have been confident as well, because the way my mother brags about it to me gives the impression that she had already heard back from the lawyer and knew what she was going to inherit before I did. Anyway, I didn't respond to that text and attempted to remove it from my memory. The next day, I contacted my lawyer and informed her that I intended to file for divorce as soon as possible. Within 2 weeks of Tom's confession, I filed for divorce and served him. Now, all we had to do was wait for this to conclude so he could spend the rest of his life with his ex-wife's mother. But something remarkable happened, and I honestly have to thank Gran for that, because even after she's gone, she still looks out for me. I'd previously asked Gran's lawyer, the executor of the will, to notify us individually since I couldn't bear to be in the same room as my mother and Tom. So 2 days ago, she told me that my mother had already been notified of what she had inherited, and now it was my turn. I went to see her with no expectations, because I had no idea what would happen. But when I left, I think I was the happiest dang person on the planet at the time. I got all of my grandmother's money, possessions and property. However, my mother only inherited a pearl necklace and matching pearl earrings that Gran used to wear. That was all my mother inherited. Gran apparently left everything to me, since she'd spent her entire life caring for my mother. But now that she was approaching 60, my mother was mature enough to start looking after herself. So, paradoxically, my Gran, who had always warned me that I'd be on my own after she died, had made sure that I was self-sufficient enough not to rely on my inheritance. And the one woman who'd been counting on Gran her entire wretched existence had been left with nothing. So in reality, she was the one who was alone. It was karma at its most evil, and I've never felt more vindicated than I did in that moment. My mother had found out barely an hour before me, but after that, I had no idea what would happen. I was excited because I knew that even if my mother didn't try to contact me, Tom would, which is exactly what happened. The guy might have waited it out for the sake of putting on a show, but he was impatient and texted me the next day, stating he had made a major mistake and wanted to come back to me if I still wanted him. He claimed that he and my mother were never meant to be, and that spending those few days with her had made him realize how fortunate he had been with me, so he had come to his senses and wanted to give our marriage another shot. I literally literally laughed out loud when I read his pathetic attempt at reconciliation. They presumably had no idea. I knew my mother had inherited very little, and there was no large inheritance to look forward to anymore. After a day of thinking about what to say to Tom, I eventually answered his text with a clown emoji and blocked him. I was also certain that he had not told my mother the truth, so I grabbed a copy of the text he had sent me and forwarded it to her along with 3 clown emojis. I shut off my phone after that because I didn't want to deal with the inevitable turmoil that would follow. Instead, I decided to watch Netflix and enjoy my night without Tom or my mother bothering me. The next morning, I learned about the aftermath of my text. My mum's next-door neighbour's daughter told me everything that happened. My mother still lives in the house where I grew up, FYI. My grandfather had given that house to his wife and daughter to live in, so after Gran died, my mother remained to live there. My neighbour's daughter and I are friends, so she was fairly open with me when she told me that at 11 o'clock, she began hearing a lot of yelling from my mother's house, but no one went to investigate because their family knew what type of person my mother was and didn't like her at all. Then there was a loud cry, which prompted them to emerge. My insane mother had physically forced Tom out of the home, and he was lying on the pavement while she flung everything at him and screamed the most vile, disgusting things at him. Tom yelled because she had snatched a hardback book and flung it at him, hitting him right in the forehead. When her neighbours found him, he had already been hit and was attempting to staunch the bleeding with his hands. It was a serious gash, and he needed 8 stitches, which was terrifying to hear. He also filed charges against my mother, and while she just had to pay a large fee because it was a misdemeanor at most, it was still terrifying because Tom was seriously injured. She hadn't intended for him to be so harmed, and she hadn't been thinking well at the time, so the officers let her off easy. It also helped that she had a great lawyer and was friends with the district attorney's wife. Of course, my mother blamed me for everything when she came home and texted me a bunch of awful things from her second phone that I hadn't blocked, which I've been doing my best to ignore, but I can't help but wonder if what occurred was truly my fault. What Tom and my mother did to me is awful, but now I feel like I should have just counted my blessings rather than interfering in their lives to mess with them. What I did was motivated by spite and rage, and I don't take pride in it. If I had understood the absurd implications, I would never have sent that screenshot to my mother. I literally just wanted to make them both feel horrible, but I never intended for anyone to get gravely wounded. My mother has no history of physical violence, to my knowledge, so this was not anything I could have anticipated. I'm devastated by what happened, and my mother's persistent attempts to victimize herself and portray me as the bad guy are exacerbating the situation. Even Tom has been posting cryptic lines about treachery and other topics, which is quite ironic. But that's beside the point right now. I feel like they're making me the bad guy merely to pass the burden to someone else, but I'm not sure. I'm definitely to blame for attempting to ruin my mother and soon-to-be ex-husband's relationship, after my mother boasted about how she snatched my man with an inheritance she doesn't even own. Update 1. Okay, so thank you everybody for your incredible support in the comments. Thank you for all of your kind thoughts, especially those who praise Gran. Yes, she was one of a kind, and I believe I was extremely fortunate to have her in my life. Truly one of the luckiest persons alive to have had a magnanimous personality like Gran's as a part of my youth. That makes up for having a mother like mine, LOL. I no longer feel bad about what happened because what I did was not that serious. They damaged my marriage, so I ruined theirs. Tit for tat. My mother was the one who went nuts and attacked the guy she apparently loves, so I'm not going to feel horrible about it. She's the insane one here, not me, and she's not going to make me feel like the bad guy when she did everything wrong. Tom was hurt. I feel awful for him because a violent attack is never justifiable, but he's also the guy who cheated on his long-term spouse with their mother. That's really gross, and I can't see somebody thinking they still have the right to beg their partner to forgive and accept them after doing something like that. He was cheating on me and my mother. I'm sorry he was hurt, but it's not my fault, not my problem either. So I've opted to block them across all platforms. I even blacklisted my mother on PayPal, so you know this is serious. Ha! On a serious note, however, I've been considering a restraining order after my mother lost it. There's no telling what she'll do next, and if she's upset with me for wrecking her relationship, she might come after me. I don't want that, but I also don't want to give up my house and career, for which I've worked so hard, and relocate just because my mother is crazy. So a restraining order is my best option right now to protect myself from the insane dinosaur. I just hope it does not come to that. Update 2. It appears that I may have to petition for a restraining order after all. I had ignored my mother for over 3 weeks and was starting to move on. Tom had also responded to my divorce petition, and he was not challenging it, so it felt like things were returning to normal, and with enough treatment and self-love, I'd eventually be over this awful occurrence. Unfortunately, my mother chose to return to terrify me, and yesterday I saw her waiting for me in my front yard, right outside my door. I had just returned home from a long day at work, and I was not in a good mood. I warned her to leave, or I'd call the cops from inside the car, but she didn't budge, telling me that I could do whatever I wanted, but she wasn't going to move until she spoke with me about the inheritance. I told her she could speak to me from a distance, because I was curious to hear what she had to say, and she told me frankly that she wanted half of whatever I'd inherited, because it was fair since Gran was her mother and not just my grandmother. I actually laughed in her face, and told her that she wasn't the right person to be discussing what was fair. Then, I told her to leave because I wasn't giving her a jack, and called 911 in case she did anything funny. She stared at me and began walking towards my car, so I immediately rolled up the windows. I did it just in time too, because as soon as she approached the car, she kicked the passenger side panel, denting it. I noticed the dent only after I got out of the car, which I didn't do until I had seen her get into her own car and drive away rather far. I shot it as evidence, and I already have security footage from cameras outside my house to show that my mother made the dent. Then I called my lawyer and told her what had happened, and I said I wanted to file a restraining order against my mother as well, which is currently occurring. I believe my mother dislikes the concept of enjoying a tranquil life and has to constantly screw things up. I attempted to make a police report, but because she is friends with the DA's wife, the precinct head informed me that his hands were tied and he couldn't help the matter. It's fine though, because at least I have the security footage, which she cannot change. It includes her face and other details. I've even downloaded it and saved it on my laptop so I don't lose it at any time. The next few days will be extremely stressful due to all of the visits I'll have to make to court, but at least I'll be rid of these jerks. Update 3. Hello everyone, I've been busy lately with the divorce process and everything. We're currently in the thick of settlement negotiations, and it's quite frustrating. At the very least, I was able to obtain a restraining order against my mother last week, so that is resolved. Phew. Tom and his lawyer have devised a bunch of lies, so I'm trying to compile all of the evidence of his cheating for the next meeting, and maybe that'll put a stop to it. It's bothersome, but I go to therapy on a regular basis to cope with and process my anger so that it doesn't interfere with my everyday life. If I've learned anything from this, it's that I don't want to become like my insane mother. I simply needed to vent here for a time, but I'm feeling better now, and I'll probably come back once the divorce is final. This will suffice for the time being.